Previously, we saw that plants go through a lot of trouble to avoid self-pollination. They separate the production of pollen and ovules in time or in space, and even have evolved complex self-incompatibility systems. These systems are favored because of the costs of inbreeding depression, which decreases the fitness of self relative to outcrossed individuals. But self-pollination is not always disadvantageous, even if there is high inbreeding depression. For instance, if there is no possibility to mate with another individual, even lousy, inbred and degenerate offspring would be a better solution than no offspring at all. This regularly occurs in small populations that are subject to genetic drift. Imagine, for some random reason, over 85% of the individuals in this population have died out. By pure chance, the only self-incompatible genotype remaining in the population is the pink one. Despite having potential mating partners, because of their self-incompatibility, these plants cannot self-pollinate nor pollinate each other, so the population will be doomed to extinction. Under such circumstances, reproducing through self-pollination, even when the offspring suffers extremely high inbreeding depression, is still preferred to no reproduction at all. This is a phenomenon called breakdown of self-incompatibility. Do you remember the example illustrations of inbreeding depression in mustard? Mustard, like a lot of Brassicaceae species, is usually self-incompatible. The parental plant had to undergo a particular treatment before pollination in order to break down the self-incompatibility mechanism. And because of the high number of accumulated recessive deleterious alleles, a lot of its offspring is homozygous and has very reduced growth after self-pollination. I personally suspect that some of these plants will reach the reproductive stage before they die. But the offspring on the far right does not seem to be doing so bad. It actually managed to reach the flowering stage despite being the product of self-pollination. This is likely by chance. This offspring did not inherit deleterious gene combinations from its parent, or at least not as many. So despite being inbred, this individual does not suffer from high inbreeding depression. Because of this variation in the offspring quality, inbreeding depression can be reduced over time by purging the deleterious alleles in the population. Imagine a population where some individuals are homozygote recessive for a deleterious allele. This allele has a negative impact on the fitness of homozygote individuals, and they die before they are capable of producing any seeds. So only individuals that have at least one functional allele will be able to reproduce. Every time the recessive allele becomes visible to selection, because it is in a homozygote recessive form, it will be eliminated by the population. This unmasking of the recessive allele is very fast in selfing populations because the increased production of homozygote offspring via selfing. So over time, the frequency of the deleterious allele will decrease until it is completely eliminated from the population. At this stage, we can have a population that is highly selfing but suffers no inbreeding depression. The downside of this purging is that we're losing genetic variability in the population, especially if the population is small, because of random genetic drift. Although it comes at a cost of increased inbreeding depression in the short term and decreased genetic diversity on the long term, self-pollination could be advantageous if there are no available mating partners or pollinators. This typically happens when a species is introduced or migrates towards a new habitat which is not suitable for its growth or for the survival of its pollinators. Typically, we expect that populations which are closer to the edge of their natural habitat to have increased self-pollination compared to species that are towards the center of their range. This hypothesis assumes that the conditions for the species' survival and reproduction, including pollinator availability, are optimal at the center of the range and they're deteriorating when approaching the edge of the range. Hence, the population density will be the highest in optimal conditions and decrease towards the edge. This was tested in Clarkia xanthina, an endemic species of California. The species has a limited distribution range in central California, and a dozen of population in this range were studied along a transect that went from the center of its range to its edge, marked by the dashed line. Firstly, an assay of pollinator visits was made in each population, expressed as the number of pollinators per flower. You can clearly see the negative correlation between the species' geographic range and pollinators' abundance. The further we go from the center of the range, the fewer pollination visits are there per flower. Next, pollen limitation for self and outcross pollen was estimated. A high pollen limitation simply means that there is not enough pollen to fertilize all available ovules. This is estimated by supplementing flowers with pollen after they have been naturally pollinated. And you can see how the outcross pollen limitation increases towards the edge of the range, so populations that are further from the optimal range have less opportunity for outcrossing. The self-pollen limitation, however, does not show a significant relationship with the species range. So no matter in what conditions is the species grown, it can always self-pollinate. This is a phenomenon called reproductive assurance. By reproducing through self-pollination, when partners or pollinators are scarce, the species is assuring its existence, even if it is at the cost of decreased quality of its offspring because of inbreeding depression.